Nachts kreisen sie um meinen Kopf und nehmen mir meinen ganzen Mut. Schwarz sind sie, gemein sind sie, wer weiß schon, wie weh das tut. Versuch's, doch sie lassen sich nicht fassen, weil sie sich ungefangen lassen. Man will sie lieben, doch man muss sie hassen, weil sie mich nie in Ruhe lassen. Doch ich krieg euch, doch ich geb nicht auf, auch wenn ihr so entsetzlich viele seid. Kleine schwarze Noten lassen mir keine Ruhe. Und hinter den Noten tanzen die Töne noch so unverschämt dazu. Doch eines Tages, da fange ich euch alle einfach ein. Und ihr werdet auf meinen Partituren gefangen sein. Für immer. Und nun hört ihr mir zu.
Was ist Ihre erste Erinnerung?
What is your first memory of music, Miss Moyseowicz?
Das ist ganz genau Danzig, Jahr 1947.
It was Danzig in 1947. I remember my mother was playing piano. She was an autodidact, entirely self-taught.
Klavierspiel beigebracht. Das war so eine Art, dass sie dann einfach hatte, Klaviatur hatte sie aus.
She had a diagram of a keyboard from maybe a newspaper or some other source. I don't know exactly. And she compared it with her own piano. Here is C, here is E. And in this way, she mastered the piano to the point that she could play some of the piano literature. The pieces were not particularly demanding, but she could play Brahms waltzes and the Sonatina by Beethoven, which he composed at 11 years old. She also played songs by Schubert and Mendelssohn.
Sie spielte auch Schubert-Lieder, sie spielte Mendelssohn-Lieder. Also insofern konnten wir, also ich und mein Bruder.
So, from a very early age, my brother and I were able to hear beautiful music. But music always made us sad. My brother would sit on one side of the piano, myself on the other, and I would notice that we both had this sense of sadness. In fact, music has made me sad my entire life. It's not something that ever makes me feel cheerful, even popular music. It somehow produces a kind of sorrow within me.
Art von Traurigkeit bringt.
And despite this, you decided to dedicate your life to music?
So toll, weil
Yes, and that wasn't really ideal. Surprisingly, although both of my parents were musically inclined, both of them were categorically against me making a career in music, whether it be as a pianist or a composer, even though I quickly proved as a child that I could improvise.
sehr schnell gezeigt hat, dass ich improvisieren kann. Und wenn ich dann von dieser...
Composing is really just one step away from improvisation. You simply have to write it down. And at that time, that was a bit difficult for me. So when I went to conservatory later in Beethoven, my mother hired a pupil who was much older than I to write down my improvisations. Eventually, as I got older, I could write things down myself. And at 13, I composed a concerto for 2 pianos, by which point I was also quite advanced in my piano playing.
Aber da war ich schon auch sehr fortschrittlich mit meinem Klavierspiel.
did you recognize this? Was there some kind of event, or did you just realize that you hear the notes differently than other people?
Das merkte ich mir schon als Kind, weil meine Mutter
I realized it when I was a child. My mother would sing, and I would immediately be able to play it on the piano. Another example, however, was that my neighbor, a man named Jurek, often played a sonatina by Clementi. I heard him often because he practiced it over and over, and I thought to myself, well, I can play that too. So I started to play it as well, but in another key because his piano was tuned differently than mine. And with that piece, I was able to make an impression on others for the first time. That caused my mother to bring me to a conservatory for children in Gdansk. And when I was asked what I could play for them, I responded that I would play what Jurek plays. And so I played that sonatina. But I played it in a different key. They asked me how on earth I could play such songs. And when I continued to play the songs that my mother had sung, they responded greatly. It's incredible what this child can do, they said. And that was my first success. They kept saying that it couldn't be true, but they were obviously very impressed. And to this day, I still don't know if it was someone from the conservatory or just a kind individual, but someone called my parents up one evening and told them that it would be a great shame if a child of such talent like myself would stay in Gliwice. That made my mother decide that we would go to Krakow to find me a teacher. I was absolutely astonished because on the way to Krakow is Katowice. But she was firm in her decision and said, no, we are going to Krakow. So we went to Krakow. We had been told that there was a teacher there who was a specialist for Asian culture and music. However, when we arrived, we found that she was no longer there. So instead, I took my compositions and we went to the Krakow Academy of Music.
You didn't have an appointment or an audition, you just went?
I went where my mother went, wherever she took me. And it was quite rushed. My mother wanted me to play for everyone wearing different clothing, such as a skirt, and on that day I was wearing slacks. But there was no time. When we arrived at the front door, the doorman told us that the headmaster's office was straight ahead and then left. So we wasted absolutely no time. My mother ushered me into the room, where by pure coincidence, all of the deans of the academy happened to be sitting. So in essence, it was all of the most important people from the school, including Professor Wichowicz, the composer. And my mother said to them simply, I am here with my daughter. She has composed a concerto. And they responded back, well then, she should play it. So I sat down, but before I started to play, I said to them, I'm sorry, it's unfortunately written for two pianos, and I can't play the second piano, as I'm only here with my mother. And the heads of the school looked at each other, and one of them said to my mother, which, let me say, it's quite unpleasant for me to repeat this, but he really did say it. He told her that I was a young Mozart. My mother was, of course, very pleased. However, I found that I had no special privileges at home. I was not treated like a child prodigy. I still had to do what children normally had to do at that time, such as cleaning the windows, the floors, etc. But I still found myself composing. And that I was composing, I don't think my mother always noticed. She's writing something, she would say. And that usually meant that I was composing. And then, of course, we had the problem of how I would get from Gliwice to Krakow.
What year was that?
That was 1957. In Krakow, I had a teacher who thought that my methods of playing Mozart concertos needed to be changed, that how I had played them in Gliwice was incorrect. She thought I should play differently, in that my hand position should change, etc. Of course, for me, that was a minor catastrophe. But fortunately, that was only the first class. Then came the second class, and they were somehow a bit more welcoming and friendly towards me. But further into my studies at the Music Lyceum, I was having difficulties, to the point that I thought I might fail the general subjects. This was particularly worrying when they realized that I wasn't terribly good at mathematics, nor was I good at chemistry. But one day I had the extreme luck to hear someone playing piano during one of our breaks. It was a student. She was a few classes ahead of me, and above all, she was a fantastic pianist. That day, she was playing an etude by Chopin in C minor. I opened the door, and upon entering, told her, "You play fabulously." Now, perhaps because I had told her this, she spoke to me and asked me who I was, for I was much younger than she. She was in her last year of school and was preparing at that time for her exit examinations. I responded that I was from Gliwice and told her that I was having problems with school. Her response was wonderful. She said that I was very sweet and that I had also comforted her that day, because apparently she had been having a bit of a crisis with her playing. She also insisted that I come home to meet her parents. I had no problems with this, so I went over and I met her parents, who were lovely, very nice, and very Catholic. She also told me that she would help me with my problems in chemistry and math. "You have to get into the third class," she said. And so things got a little bit better, at least with regard to my general subjects. The problems with my piano teacher, however, were only getting worse. I just couldn't get along with her at all. But then Barbara Buczek, this very good pianist who had invited me home to meet her parents, went to the director and to his wife, who was her teacher. They said simply, "We will take her." And with that, I became a piano student of the director, even though he was not the director of the piano class and had no piano students of his own. And thanks to this friendship with Barbara Buczek, who was from Krakow and had a stable home life, I was able to find a sense of stability in myself. I found that my grades were getting better, that I was playing better, and that my life as a general whole was getting better and better. Now, it's very important to note that at that time, teachers were very poorly paid. And because of this, students' parents often needed to help support the teachers financially. My parents, however, could simply not afford to do this. That being said, it was still quite a shock when one day my teacher, the director, sat me down and told me something so unbelievably bold. I'll never forget it. He told me that Franz Liszt taught either beautiful or wealthy women, but that I was neither wealthy nor beautiful.
Not very nice.
But then I responded, "But you are not Franz Liszt."
Good answer.
And that was probably not the best thing to say, but I had to protest. I mean, what else could I do? Not too long after this incident, a young woman came to the academy who was a student teacher. She was quite an exceptional case. She wanted to finish her studies and get her diploma, but due to various circumstances, such as the war, her studies and diploma were delayed. She was still quite a young teacher, a student teacher. And so the director said, "Well, she needs to have some pupils. She can't simply sit around playing piano all day. Let's send Moyseowicz to her. I, of course, resisted this idea at first. I did not want to switch. But then he called a boarding house, which was better than the one I had been staying in. And so once again, I found myself with a new teacher. However, when I went to her for my first lesson, I was once again shocked to find that, according to her, the methods of playing piano that had been taught to me before were also not correct. So once again, I had to learn a new method. And I thought, what do they want from me? Either I can play the piano or I can't. But still, my teacher was very intelligent, and she did want me to somehow be happy. So she gave me fantastic pieces to play. She gave me a Beethoven sonata that I liked. She gave me the Chopin pieces that I wanted to play. She gave me a Bach prelude and a fugue. She gave me pieces that were really very ambitious.
And that made a big impact on you.
Then there was the question, where should I practice? The boarding house where I stayed only had 2 or 3 pianos, and everyone had to practice. This was not limited to pianists. Clarinetists, horn players, everyone still had to practice piano. So during the day, there was hardly any opportunity for me to practice. So I started practicing at night. I tried to always start at 12 so I would not bother anyone, and I practiced as much as I possibly could. The more I practiced, the happier and more enthusiastic my teachers became, which also meant that they started treating me better as a person. In the end, I received my diploma with piano as my main instrument. Later, when I had my audition and played at the Academy in Krakow, I played my concerto, with Barbara again on the second piano. My composition Media Vita was performed, and immediately, with no further exam, I was accepted into the Academy as a composition student of Krzysztof Penderecki.
Media vita in morte sumus, quem ferimus adjutore misite domine, qui propecatis nostris juste irasseris.
Salvator, amare morti ne tradas nos.
Sancte Deus, Sancte Fortis, Sancte Misericors Salvator, amare morti ne tradas nos. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
Sancte Deus, Sancte Fortis,
Sancte Misericors Salvator, amare morti ne tradas nos.
On paper, at least, I was a student of Penderecki.
The great Penderecki.
Yes, but at that time he was not so great. However, his career was growing, and he was slowly becoming successful.
What was the mood like at the academy at that time?
I was very happy to be there, because the other students were very friendly, and we had fun. We hardly had any contact to Penderecki. He was off pursuing his career and was often in Germany or Sweden, all over the place. I was pretty happy about that. In fact, most of the students were. And this resulted in quite an uplifted and friendly environment. During the 1 year that I was there, 2 concerts were organized. At the first concert, I played my piano sonata number 2. Penderecki had no idea about piano music, so I played my completed sonata for him, and his response was to say, "I like it, but today you have to play more aggressively. Don't play normally." To which I responded, "I'm not going to attack the piano. I'm going to play my usual way." This response was successful, and I performed 3 more of my songs.
Und dann kam zweites Konzert, das war allgemein für
This second concert was different. It was comprised of compositions from all over Poland. 3 or 4 different music academies came together to participate and present the works of their students. This concert was a great success for me, as Barbara Buczek came to help me play my piano sonata number 3, as well as the Media Vita, the work which I had presented at my audition for the Academy of Krakow. She played wonderfully, as was usual, and at the end of the evening, I received the most applause. The concert was to be repeated 1 month later at the Philharmonic Hall. I was very surprised, however, to see that my name was not listed on the program. I decided to ask Penderecki, because on paper, at least, I was his student. I say only on paper, since he had nothing to do with my piano sonatas or the Media Vita. And he told me he didn't know why, that he really couldn't say. But to me it seemed strange. Even my mother argued that it was crazy, that if I was a student of the academy, they should be trying to help me, not hinder me, that they really shouldn't be blocking my efforts. Otherwise, what was the point of even attending the academy? My parents had been at the first performance. They had witnessed how positively my work was received.
Ich dachte mir, na dann sage ich auf Wiedersehen.
So my reaction was to say goodbye. And diplomacy was never really my strong point, so first I spoke with Penderecki's wife. And I said to her, "I am learning nothing here. Penderecki is never around, and he's never going to publish my work. If I can't get my works published as a student of the academy, then what's the point of staying here? I have to find another school."
Dann muss ich mir eine andere Schule suchen.
As I went back from Krakow to Gliwice, one stop along the way was Katowice, where there is an Academy of Music, as I very well knew. So I got off the train, went up the stairs, and directly ran into Professor Szabelski, the composer. I was very direct. I told him my name was Gabriela Moyseowicz, and that I was coming from Krakow, where I had studied at the academy. I said I could no longer study there, for it was very difficult to live, to find a place to practice, and that some rather unpleasant things had happened to me there. I said I would like to switch, to study instead in Katowice, where I was closer to my home in Gliwice. Naturally, he asked me what I had composed, and in response I gave him a tape. Back then, we only had giant tapes, but he took it right away, listened to it, and wanted me in his class, effective immediately. I didn't have to do anything. He knew the administration and took care of everything himself. So without making any effort at all, I was suddenly enrolled at the Academy at Katowice. It was important to me, however, to keep up my piano studies. So every 2 weeks I went back to Krakow to study with my professor, Mieszkowska. She did not teach at the academy. She taught rather at the Lyceum, which in my opinion was much preferred. And even with my bi-weekly visits to Krakow, it was very important to do everything in my power to improve on the piano, in addition to focusing on my studies in composition. In order to get to this point, I decided to practice my piano concerto number 2 with a friend. We recorded it and then presented it to Professor Szabelski. At that time, I was in my 5th year of studies. So when he liked it so much, it convinced me to write my diploma thesis about my concerto, stating precisely why I had chosen to compose it in the way that I did, instead of using the methods that were expected of me. This proved to be quite disastrous. Apparently, I had offended people who composed differently than I did. They used effects and all kinds of extravagant things that I had never used in my music. I made atonal music, which, at the time, was very new music. And so, I unintentionally made myself enemies. But before things really came to a head, there was another concert of student compositions. And once again, my name was not listed on the program. So I went to the appropriate people, and I asked why my concerto was not being performed. Thanks to my complaint, my concerto was then given a place within the program. Of course, then we had a rehearsal, and in the rehearsal hall at the academy, there were 2 grand pianos, both of which sounded very nice. And once again, Barbara Buczek played the first piano, while I played the second. On the day of the concert, however, as we arrived, we found that one of the grand pianos was missing. When I asked where it had gone, I was informed that another student had apparently written a piece for percussion. He needed so many things, pots and bells and all sorts of items, that the entire stage was full of percussion instruments, and that there was therefore no space for a second grand piano. I immediately complained. So they offered to put an upright piano on stage, a smaller instrument, which I agreed to. There was a problem with the upright piano they brought, however. It was missing a wheel, and it stood crooked. Someone suggested that we put a stool or a chair of some sorts underneath the place where the missing wheel was, so that at the very least, the piano would stand semi-straight. And because we had no other option, that's exactly what we did. So, for the performance, I ended up playing this piano, and Barbara played the grand piano. And our performance was met with a huge applause. As we left the concert hall, lots of people were standing around talking. And one of the former headmasters of the academy, Professor Powrocznia, approached me. He told me how much he had liked my concerto, and that he was absolutely convinced that the Silesia Philharmonic would play my concerto at some point in the near future. And I was very happy to have received such a compliment.
Das hat gesagt. Naja, da habe ich mich für dieses Kompliment sehr gefreut. Und dann musste ich
Not long after, I had to defend my thesis, titled Exemplification of my compositional aesthetic based on my piano concerto No. 2. My defense was scheduled for the 24th of June.
Nun, das kommt zu diesem Moment, das war, ich meine, 24. Juni.
One evening, not long before the defense of my thesis, someone called me, an acquaintance of mine, and she told me that they were going to fail me. They're so upset at the academy about what you wrote, she said. They won't let you pass. They're going to fail you. It was 10:30 at night, the night before my defense, that she called me. She lived in Gliwice and had just come back from the academy. The next morning, my brother accompanied me to defend my thesis. He sat outside of the room and waited for me, while I endured unbelievable attacks against my opinions. They claimed that I did not allow or acknowledge any instrument that did not fall under the classical definition of what an instrument was. They argued that I was for pure music only, with conventional notation, even though I had written my opinion without mentioning any names. I simply gave my opinion, It was never my intention to offend anyone. I never tried to imply that how I write and compose was the correct way to do so, or that any particular person should change their methods and do as I do. From there, it got even worse. They hurled more and more attacks at me, one of which was that I was using foreign words, such as the word exemplification, which does not exist in Polish. They said I should have used a comparable Polish word in its place.
Ein Wort, was entsprechend hätte dem Wort. Und dann, die wollten unbedingt mich wirklich fertig machen.
They really wanted to finish me off, to crush me. Instead of 45 minutes, my defense went on for an hour and a half. Of course, I had my own weapons, and I did defend myself thoroughly. But I had no idea what I should say. So I asked my professor Szabelski directly, "Did you like my concerto?" And what did he say? He said yes.
Ja. Und das war natürlich für die, meine Gegner und seine Freunde.
This, of course, was a very unpleasant response for my opponents and their friends. At that moment, a secretary from the administration spoke up on my behalf and said, "Gentlemen, what is it exactly that you want from Miss Moyseowicz? She's already passed. What exactly is going on here?" And by that point, I had broken out into tears because I thought that they would not let me pass and that they would ultimately fail me. Fortunately, my brother was still waiting for me outside of the room, but it took me a long time to calm myself down. When I finally received my grades, my overall mark for my studies was very good, but my diploma thesis had been given a barely passing grade. There are no such differences in the world that I could possibly receive the top grade for my studies, but that my diploma thesis was barely passing. And because of this, tragedy ensued. I received no offers for work, I received no commissions, I received nothing at all.
Wie hat Ihre Musik damals...
How did your music sound back then, Miss Moyseowicz? Or how did you arrive at your style?
Ja, man kann sagen, dass im Grunde erstmal 1960.
I think that can be pinned down to 1960, when I composed a concerto. This was an atonal concerto, not one to be confused with the piece that I composed when I was 13, but rather the piece that I played for my final when I left the conservatory.
Abitur spielte. Es war schon früher, war Zeit, dass ich liebte überhaupt, wenn es geht Musik.
For me, since the beginning, it's always been about music. I loved Chopin. But there was always a big hole in my music history knowledge. The second half of the 19th century was not my thing, so to speak. That was the time when neo-romanticism started, and I personally don't like anything neo. Neo-Gothic was not my thing. Anything neo-related was really not for me. My personal preference is for original style. After Chopin came several very highly talented composers, but they did not become famous, which is something I'll never really understand. One of them, for example, was Karowicz, a composer who wrote in a style, and I say style, but I mean rather more atmospherically. But he wrote in a very similar way to Richard Strauss, as well as many other German composers. I find that I prefer the direction of Impressionism, and not such heavy music. So to me, Debussy and Ravel were very interesting. I was always afraid of the orchestras that were getting bigger and bigger, especially in the case of Wagner, who already had a monstrously large orchestra. I tend to find myself more on Chopin's side, wherein the whole world is created and conquered with only a piano. I tend to find French music more accessible.
Mir französische Musik also mehr zugänglich. Nun war das Musik natürlich nicht so tonal, ja, das war so, kann man sagen, Richtung.
This music was not so tonal. It was more bitonal in direction, at least in the sense of piano, where you have a normal cadence, like. Whereas with Debussy, it's more like. There are chords, and they are tonal, but they are completely independent from one another. There are no tonic, subdominant, or dominant chords present. And that was already a liberation from tonal thinking, which is very much like Chopin's style. In fact, he almost anticipated this shift in the epoch that he himself existed in. That being said, he had some clashes with other composers from his time. Composers such as Mendelssohn could not understand him or his theories. However, Schumann praised him and with great recognition said, "Hats off, here is a genius."
Hut ab, das ist ein Genie.
And that, of course, helped Chopin's career enormously. But in his later style, so what were in essence his best works, those were not received so well.
Mit keine große Anerkennung Echo fanden. Und also, wenn es geht den Debussy, Ravel.
Now Debussy and Ravel, as well as other music from the 20th century, I heard mostly when I went to the Philharmonic in Poland. For this I have to praise Poland, because the program was really exceptional. Composers such as Prokofiev and Bartók were often featured, and it was even required by some academies for their students to play pieces by composers from the 20th century for their exams.
Also, ich spürte nur, dass diese Richtung, Dodekaphonie, Schönberg.
There was also one point in hearing the dodecaphony of Schönberg and Webern where I realized it was not really my thing. I loved chords, and I loved harmonies. Music had to sound full, but not in this way.
Und dann zähle ich 12 Töne, weil das ist eben
And then you count to 12 because, well, you had to. And Schoenberg was right somehow. He said, you cannot simply cling to tonality. You have to make yourself independent. But in finding this independence, you walked a very fine line, and it was quite dangerous.
Sehr gefährlich, weil dann auch waren Komponisten, die im Grunde keine waren, aber die guckten nur nicht.
There were composers that were not really composers, who never wanted to repeat a note, lest they give the impression of being too tonal. Never a major third, because that was too tonal. Never a minor third. There were umpteen principles that I had to learn at the academy, or at least I had to acknowledge them. Something such as over-the-top percussion that had to be struck in a particular way, or some instrument that had to make a particular sound. That's a direction that has basically continued until today. Even today, everyone has to be original when using noise. To me, however, it's just noise. It does not speak to me. I have nothing against it. I don't want to comment on it. I'm not saying it's bad, but I don't like it. What I find to be special are harmonies, particularly those that I've thought up. I find them to be, above all, innocent. And a sound I've loved for a very long time is bells. I've always loved them, and so I tried to make them with a major third. Here's an example.
You can hear it.
Yes, and that was in a composition called Monte Cassino. I tried to imagine how the bells would have sounded.
And that composition was about the battle.
I wanted to introduce atonality into the song, like airplanes bombing. This was mainly in connection to a book that I was reading at the time about the battles on Monte Cassino.
Ein Buch gelesen über die Kämpfe auf Monte Cassino.
The tragedy of this time was how many Poles died. Was there some purpose to it? I think probably not. There's never any purpose for so many people dying. And yet, it remains a part of Poland's history.
Aber das gehört zur Geschichte Polen und das wurde
And that is important.
Ja, und besonders in kommunistischen Zeiten.
Especially during communist times, I was not allowed to write Monte Cassino. I played it publicly, of course, but the title was only Variations, nothing at all about Monte Cassino. The Western Front was not allowed to be praised. That was the front with the Americans, the British. According to the communist reign, only those who fought on the Eastern Front with the Soviet army were considered to be real soldiers. All the others that died were not important.
So wichtig. Und dann, das war im Grunde erste Komposition und dann war meine erste Sonate, die war schon.
And so Monte Cassino was in essence my first atonal composition. My first sonata had already been very much praised by a reviewer, Jan Waleski, who said that when I played it in public, it was absolutely atonal music. Then came the Media Vita, which is also completely atonal, as you already know. From that point, I knew that the direction of my music had absolutely nothing to do with tonality.
Meine Musik hat mit Tonalität nichts zu tun. Und wenn jemand meine Musik
So if anyone ever thinks my music is tonal, then they are either musically illiterate, or the music is so suggestive that the dissonances are not heard. And these are the only two possibilities.
Es sind zwei Möglichkeiten. Und das zu verstehen, das heißt zu verstehen.
Now, understanding this and what it means to understand this are two entirely different things. When I play my music in public, my compositions, I have never failed to generate a great amount of applause. But it's different when the music is on CD. You have to make an effort. You have to listen to it a couple of times. But back then, that was always the case. No composer was celebrated immediately for their works. For example, there were varied reactions towards Beethoven, one of which was, "Why is that so loud? You can't hear anything." And it was an uproar, at least until they realized.
Ich will hier keine Vergleiche mit mir machen, Beethoven, lassen wir ihn. Aber,
Now, I'm not comparing myself to Beethoven. I go my own way. But of course, I'm annoyed when someone flips through one of my compositions and says, "That's kind of like Bartók." My compositions are very complicated because they're absolutely atonal, and it makes it very difficult to compare the two. And my question to them is always, what is your approach when you do not understand? But also, how do you approach not wanting to understand? This is, and this has been, the problem of my life. It's said a priori, a woman, they say, with supposedly new music. But it is not supposedly new music. It is new music. And it makes me so very happy when I encounter other people that accept this and feel the same. One wonderful example was recently when I was able to hear my compositions 5 days in a row. Those were the best days of my life. The day when my second symphony, my piano concerto number 2, my intentionally tonal Hommage à la Pologne, and Media Vita atonal were performed and recorded in Koszalin, Poland.
And to play this lively, brilliant, and full of contrast music is a great joy and a great privilege for all of us. So thank you so much.
Vielen Dank. Ich spreche Deutsch. Diesmal.
I think it's good for the movie.
Meine Begeisterung.
I really want to express my enthusiasm for the Philharmonia Koszalińska, as well as its wonderful director. You really know what it means to be a musician. And that is not such a simple thing. It's not an easy task. But you do it so harmoniously and so fantastically that I simply do not have enough words to express it.
Thank you so much on behalf of my colleagues, the soloist, the director of the orchestra, and all of us who participate in the project. It's been a fantastic week and a great pleasure to be able to record this music.
Do you sometimes dream of music, Miss Moyseowicz? Of your own or of others?
Da muss ich Ihnen was sagen, was vielleicht ist schwer zu glauben.
Now, what I'm about to tell you might be hard to believe, but throughout my life, even while talking to you now, I've heard music playing in the back of my head. Sometimes it's my own compositions, or other times it's works of other composers. But every moment I hear it. I have not a single second without music. And I have to live with that, just as some people have to live with a constant ringing in their ear. Of course, there are some situations that arise in which this can be a very useful trick. For example, one day after a choir rehearsal in my church, someone came to me and asked if I could compose a hallelujah. It wasn't until I was driving home through the tunnel from Tegel to Charlottenburg that the first motif from Hallelujah came to me. It was already quite late when I arrived home, after 9 p.m., but I sat down and I wrote the first part of Hallelujah. The next day I called my friend, Christine Korepke, and I told her that I would play the second movement of the Hallelujah. And that's exactly what I did. And it sounded like this. I must say, however, that all other friendships I've had in my life have paled in comparison to the friendship that I've shared with my friend of 28 years, Hertha Steingrüber. She has been with me for many years, and in basically everything I do, she is always with me and by my side.
Jetzt habe ich wirklich immer wieder im Kopf ein Konzert.
Recently, I've had a concerto for cello and orchestra in my head. And I hear this cello, I hear the orchestra, and I just have to sit down and write it. But I can't say that I can just write new music. Atonal music is not like tonal music in that way. It's not that I sit down and something comes to me. But rather with atonal music, something has to be haunting me, pursuing me. So much so that I say, now I really have to sit and write something down. And therefore, I appreciate my atonal music more. It's much closer to me than tonal music. But of course, I can write tonal music, if someone asks.
Wir sind sehr neugierig auf die Werke, die von ihm noch kommen werden.
We are very curious to hear the pieces that are still to come and also to hear the recording that has just been made and surely will find its way through the world. In conclusion, you have quoted Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically a quote from his Ecce Homo. I still have enough Polish left in me to let all other music go if I can keep Chopin.
Ja, das ist auch meine Meinung.
That is also my opinion. I say that Chopin inspires me, but it's not only because he's such a great composer. What I find to be unique about him is the spirit of his music. It pursues me somehow. I'm always hearing these unbelievable harmonies that he used, which impress me, not because he invented them, but because he used them so uniquely and in his own way. He's always been my role model, but I know that it would be extremely difficult to ever achieve as much as Chopin did. In fact, it wouldn't only be difficult, it's entirely impossible.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moyseowicz.
And I thank you.
Ja, einen wunderschönen guten Abend. Mein Name ist Bernd Rolfes.
Good evening. My name is Bernd Rolfes. I have known Ms. Moyseowicz and Ms. Steingröver for over 20 years, and I want to recount a short anecdote that made a great impression on me and is deeply anchored in my heart. I think about it often, and I also tell the story often. 4 years ago, in a very beautiful villa in Grünewald, Berlin, Ms. Moyseowicz and Ms. Steingröver were visiting me.
Und Frau Moyseowicz und Frau Steingröber war zum Gespräch bei mir. Und da stand in diesem...
There was a Steinway grand piano at the villa. We went into the room, and I spontaneously asked Ms. Moyseowicz, maybe you would like to play a little something for us. Ms. Moyseowicz did not hesitate for long. She sat right down at the piano and started to play.
Klavierstuhl gesetzt und hat angefangen zu spielen.
It was so moving for me, because what she was playing was incredible, and I know she writes atonal music, and she's a very well-known and talented artist, but I prefer tonal music, and that was what she played. So when she sat down at the piano, it really impressed me deeply. These are moments that I will never forget in my life, and whenever I am at the villa, I tell the story about you, Ms. Moyseowicz. That was really wonderful.
Wunderschön und das bleibt auch nachhaltig, denke ich, in meinem Gedächtnis.
Ich habe hier Gott sei Dank auch Menschen begegnet, die waren zu mir sehr freundlich.
I have, thank God, met very many people over the years, many of them very nice people, such as Carmen Schüttich and her husband. Thanks to Carmen, I had 2 piano recitals, and thanks to her husband, I was able to hear my first symphony, as well as Fuga e Postludium, which is coincidentally tonal, whereas my symphony, number 1, the Shadow Symphony, is entirely atonal.
Aber ich meine, die Musik spricht die Menschen an. Natürlich ist das...
I found that my music speaks to people. Of course, it's not the same when you listen to it on a CD or via other media. But when my music is heard live, it never fails to resonate with people. It's not something that I can explain, but my music never fails to captivate audiences.
Meine Musik doch die Menschen an, sollte ich wollte.
Yes, but you faced your difficulties in practicing. We amateurs practice regularly, but still can't play a thing. And you were always able to practice the Steinway through the night.
Ja, das war auch sehr nett von Steinway. Es war
Yes, and that was very nice of Steinway. There was also a family, the Kaiser Schumann, whose grandfather, Jörg Schumann, was a composer, not to be confused with Robert Schumann.
dem Robert Schumann.
Okay.
Ja, und dann ich habe auch ein paar Mal
Several times, I was able to give piano recitals thanks to this family. So as a thank you, I recorded a ballad that their grandfather, the composer Jörg Schumann, had written. This ballad has also been posted to YouTube, where I've seen that it's accumulated quite a few views. But unfortunately, in this effect, it doesn't show me as a composer, and rather shows me to be only a pianist.
also Pianistin bin. So, das, also ich hatte, wie gesagt, sehr...
But anyways, getting back to my original point, I can really say that I've met so many wonderful people here who helped me so much at the beginning of my career. They helped me find my feet and find my way. But when it comes to music, I have to say that I've not been so fortunate, although that was the main reason that I came to Germany.
Das war überhaupt Ursache, warum ich nach
Hergekommen bin, ja.
Although you know Ms. Steingröver, who knows so many people and also made contacts.
Ja, mir wollten immer Menschen helfen, aber die...
Yes, there were always people who wanted to help me, but no one was ever in an influential enough position to actually achieve anything. All that I tried to achieve on my own, whatever it was, I was either ridiculed for, or it failed to materialize. So regarding my music, unfortunately, I've never really felt good about coming to Germany. This has been, however, absolutely compensated for by the many friends that I've made along the way. Even those that have nothing directly to do with music. They were and always have been my friends. When I played somewhere, they came and they supported me. Nowadays, I've had a bit more luck, particularly in Poland and with this CD release. And I truly cannot imagine what my life would have been like in the past 20 years had I not been lucky enough to meet this fantastic person sitting next to me here today.
Diese wundervolle Frau.
Person, die kennengelernt habe, ja.